If you've watched any of my videos, you're probably very familiar with the idea of a federal standoff. Most of these federal standoffs end with a lot of people dying and any of the government's problems not being shown until like a decade later. Well, what if I told you that there was a standoff where one family went up against the federal government not once, but twice, even taking them to court and winning? We're going to go ahead and get into the story and controversy of the Bundy standoff, but as always, thank you for watching. Cliven Bundy is a Nevada rancher who found himself in the national spotlight in 2013 for leading an armed standoff against multiple branches of the federal government. Like most stories in today's world, Cliven Bundy has become a political lightning rod. So there might be more to the story than what you've heard, including why this conflict came to the boiling point that it did, and the government's total mishandling of the court case, which essentially allowed Bundy to walk away from over 2 decades of breaking the law and refusing to pay over 7 figures of fines and permitting fees. And of course, it's up to you if that's a good or bad thing. Now, the reason why Cliven Bundy's story has become so politically charged isn't without merit. I mean, after all, Bundy is on record as saying his actions were motivated by his belief that the federal government has no authority over various public lands. He considers himself an advocate for states' rights and believes states should control the land within their borders. Now, the legitimacy of many of those views, at least legally, is flimsy at best. Even if you agree with his views and think that it should be that way morally, it's a bit of a stretch to say it should be that way legally. Regardless, these views would set Bundy and his family on a collision course with the government, challenging their authority over public land and exposing some of the dirty tactics and possible illegal behavior of the FBI. Never heard that from me before. Which came to a climax with both sides on the brink of an explosive and violent standoff reminiscent of the Waco incident. So to paint a picture of what's going on, let's start by talking about the Bundy family. Cliven Bundy comes from a family of ranchers, which he claims goes as far back as the 1870s. When his father became a cattle grazer in the southeastern part of Nevada. To promote westward expansion during the era of homesteading in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, ranchers were allowed to let their cattle graze openly on public lands in the western United States. But eventually, these lands began to become overgrazed and undermanaged. And you may hear that and think, all right, what's the big deal with land becoming overgrazed? Well, it's because those random pieces of land are pretty important. See, the problem with overgrazing is that it leads to soil erosion and overall land degradation, which negatively impacts the ecosystem. And you may follow that up with, all right, well, what's the big deal with soil erosion? Well, when you take some soil erosion that existed in the 1930s and combine it with the economic collapse of the Great Depression, you get the Dust Bowl. I swear this relates back to the Bundy story, just bear with me. Following World War I, demand for wheat was at an all-time high, and in accordance with the laws of economics, as demand for wheat increased, so did the price of wheat. Wanting to capitalize on the surging price of the crops, farmers began overgrazing and deplowing the land with a relatively new invention, the gasoline-powered tractor. But as the Great Depression hit, demand for wheat began to slow, and the market for it collapsed. So hundreds of thousands of acres of native grasses, which had been overgrazed and replaced with wheat, began to dry out. This was a problem because prairie grass acts as a natural anchor for the topsoil and moisture that it grows in. Wheat, unfortunately, is not an anchor for these things, and especially when nobody is buying it and all of the wheat dries up. Once a serious, prolonged drought and brutal winds hit the southern plains in the early 1930s, huge dust storms began to sweep the United States, masking the sun and turning the skies dirt black, as well as everything below. Some of these dust storms were so massive that they reached Washington, D.C., New York City, and the West Coast. Plagues of locusts and herds of wild rabbits finished off the crops that did grow, creating an apocalyptic environment that affected over 100 million acres of land by the time it was all said and done. So several farm families who were now destitute from the failed crops fled west. The federal government brought back much of this land, designating it as protected, and vowed to restore its native grasses and restore the local ecology. All great things, right? In tandem with this, in 1934, Congress passed the Taylor Grazing Act, at the request of Western ranchers. This action would form grazing districts, which would then be regulated by the federal government, slowing the degradation of the land that unregulated grazing was causing. An attempt to strike a balance between getting farmers back on their feet, but also not causing the same conditions that led to the Dust Bowl. They're completely different situations, but this is weirdly reminiscent to me of the whole cheese thing, where the government was like, oh, farmers need to sell their milk, so we'll buy it, and we'll just do that forever. Which brings us to somewhere around the 1970s and our old friend, Mr. Bundy. Part of that Grazing Act was the establishment of grazing permits, where, in exchange for a fee, as with anything with the government, cattle could graze on an assigned plot of land. This would allow the government to manage the land to ensure it didn't become overgrazed as it had all those decades ago. Bundy used and paid for one of these permits for his cattle in what was called the Bunkerville allotment. He owned property and land nearby on 160 acres near Bunkerville, Nevada, approximately 80 miles southeast of Las Vegas near the Arizona border. This permit was purchased from an organization called the Bureau of Land Management, or BLM for short, not to be confused with the other BLM, Black Lives Matter, which I believe is a joke that the White Lotus has already made. I also feel like I remember a bunch of people getting mad a couple years ago because someone thought it would be funny to share around info that BLM is buying land because, you know, there's documents of like the Bureau of Land Management buying land, but it looked like the government was allotting a lot of land for Black Lives Matter. So a bunch of people who just saw that information and coincidentally also had identical Facebook profile pictures of them sitting in a truck with glasses on, looking directly into the camera. Those people got really mad about that. I could have also hallucinated all of that, but it wouldn't be a first. The Bureau of Land Management is a federal agency within the United States Department of the Interior that manages public lands. Its responsibilities include conservation, land use, and grazing rights. From around 1973 until 1993, the Clive and Bundy paid the BLM a grazing fee of $1.35 per month per cow, bull, or calf pair. After 20 years, however, the Endangered Species Act led to restrictions on grazing in an effort to protect what was a then dwindling desert tortoise population. These new restrictions reduced livestock numbers on the allotment and restricted off-road vehicle use in certain areas. So Bundy, who was having his cattle graze on this piece of land, was then told that he has to quit grazing as many cattle because there is these tortoises nearby that they want to protect. And because they want to protect them, he can't have as many cows now. So you can imagine how that went. Bundy refused to comply with these new restrictions and, as an act of protest, stopped paying his grazing fees. He argued that the federal government had no right to control land, insisting this was a matter that should be handled by state and local jurisdiction, and he continued to allow his cattle to graze despite the new regulations. He even tried sending a check for the required fees to the local county in Bunkerville, but the check was returned due to the state's lack of jurisdiction on the matter. So he is arguing that the state of Nevada should have control of the land, going as far to try to give them the money that he owes to the Bureau of Land Management, saying it shouldn't be a federal matter. But that's also not how it works. You can't just suddenly get upset that the people you were paying money to are the people who own the land and decide it's different. Like, you can't just one day be like, okay, federal government, here's a check for the cows, and they're like, hey, actually, there's turtles there, so don't do that. Okay, local government, here's a check for the cows. A back and forth battle between the Bureau of Land Management and Bundy ensued from 1993 until his first court case in 1998. During this time, the BLM issued multiple notices demanding payment and compliance with the new grazing restrictions, and Bundy repeatedly ignored them, insisting that the federal government was not entitled for control over the land. In response, the BLM attempted to revoke his grazing rights and threatened to impound his cattle. But Bundy, of course, ignored that too, continuing to allow his livestock to graze freely and publicly challenging the BLM's authority. Others, who believed he was taking a stand against the overstepping of government powers, gave their support. As Bundy refused to vacate the land, pressure on the feds would grow, and in March of 1998, the United States government filed their first official case against Cliven Bundy. This would be just the first step in a long, intense legal battle. So to begin, let's talk about that 1998 court case. In 1998, Bundy filed a motion to dismiss, arguing that the government, and by extension, the court, lacked jurisdiction. He cited Article 4, Section 3 of the U.S. Constitution, which grants Congress the power to dispose of and make rules regarding U.S. territory and property. Bundy contended that this clause did not grant the federal government permit control over Nevada land, and that once Nevada became a state in 1864, the land should have been under state jurisdiction. However, the federal government countered that the land in question had been under its control before Nevada statehood, and remained so under the property clause, which had been upheld by multiple court rulings affirming federal authority over public lands. Effectively, the federal government is arguing that they can own land even if it's inside of another state, which makes sense because all the land in the country is inside of a state, and Bundy is arguing that's stupid. Bundy lost the case and was ordered to remove his livestock before November 30th, 1998. But, as you might have guessed, he ignored this ruling entirely and continued grazing his cattle against the court's order. 15 years later, in 2013, the federal government once again called Bundy to trial. It's insane they can tell you to do something once and then you can just not do that for 15 years and then they get upset again. By this point, his cattle had expanded their grazing beyond the Bunkerville allotment. The court ruled against Bundy once again, reaffirming that the land was federally owned, and ordering him to remove the cattle within 45 days. Cliven insisted that his family had preemptive grazing rights dating back generations, but the court reiterated that grazing permits did not equate to land ownership. The ruling reinforced previous decisions that Bundy was in violation of federal law, setting the stage for the government's next course of action. The BLM began planning an operation to impound Bundy's herd, which had grown significantly. Their plan was comprised of 4 key components. 1. The use of helicopters and horseback riders to locate and round up trespassing cattle. 2. Deploying temporary holding pens and transport trucks to gather and relocate impounded livestock. 3. Establishing designated operation zones with armed federal agents to secure the area and prevent interference from Bundy supporters. And 4, coordination with contracted cowboys and animal control specialists to ensure the humane handling and transport of the cattle. So effectively, the government's like, all right, we're tired of this guy. We told him to get off. We gave him 15 years. This is our land. And now, as far as we're concerned, there's just a bunch of random cows on it. So we'll round them up. Well, you can imagine what Bundy's response to this whole thing was and why the video has the word standoff in the title. In late March of 2014, the BLM issued an intent to impound the grazing livestock. Bundy ignored the notices, shocker, and in interviews with local newspapers, stated that he was ready to battle the BLM. This drew the attention of various anti-government groups and private militias, along with Bundy's family, friends, and neighbors. On April the 5th, the actual rounding up of cattle began. Helicopters descended overhead, agents on horseback swarmed the grasslands, and the BLM started to herd Bundy's cattle into holding pens. A day later, on April the 6th, Cliven's son, Dave Bundy, was arrested during a conflict arising from the younger Bundy videotaping men near his family's ranch who he suspected were federal agents. The arrest garnered attention as Dave Bundy alluded to officers using unnecessary force, but no disciplinary action was enforced on those officers. As tensions escalated, the family claimed that snipers were targeting them and that they were being spied on. Specifically, Ryan Bundy, another one of Cliven's sons, said that in addition to snipers positioned around their ranch aiming lasers at their homes, he also saw a camera on a tripod monitoring their movements. He said he saw the device with a telephoto lens on a hill northeast of their house overlooking it. For one, I have no idea why he wouldn't have taken a photo or something of this thing. I mean, it was 2014. But at the same time, as I talked about in the Ruby Ridge video, the government is no strangers to setting up cameras and, monitoring positions around people's homes without their knowledge. So while it's not exactly far-fetched, none of these claims were substantiated at the time. And to those on the outside looking in, it seemed that the Bundys were exhibiting paranoia. In the days that followed the cattle roundup, Bundy supporters began arriving in town for what was being dubbed the Battle of Bunkerville. People were showing up with rifles, shotguns. Someone even brought a Browning M250 cal, apparently, which for those who aren't familiar is a way of saying, big bullet. Many of those who were arriving in Nevada belonged to various militias around the United States, including Operation Mutual Aid, the 3 Percenters Club, and the Oath Keepers. Some of them driving from as far away as New Hampshire, which is about a 41-hour drive. Among the militia members was a man named Ryan Payne, the founder of Operation Mutual Aid and an outspoken advocate for armed resistance against government outreach. Ammon Bundy, another one of Cliven's sons, the guy had a lot of sons, led a group of these militiamen to block a BLM convoy. After Ammon was tased by officers, Ryan Payne used the incident to solicit help from additional militias. It's also insane to me that, during that encounter, no one fired a gun. Because it's like police showing up and there's a line of people with guns like, if you come over this line, we'll shoot you. And then the guy leading gets tased and the rest are like, all right, you win today. On April the 11th, the BLM had rounded up nearly 400 cattle, but the FBI had started to become concerned. Bundy's group was growing in number and influence, and the FBI advised the BLM to cease the operation in order to avoid potential bloodshed with the approximately 200 or so of Cliven's supporters. I mean, the FBI wouldn't know anything about a standoff becoming violent, right, guys? On April 12th, just a day later, the number of supporters was estimated to have doubled to nearly 400. Some of them even arriving on horseback. Taking the advice of the FBI, the BLM called off the roundup. Clark County Sheriff Doug Gillespie informed Bundy that the feds were retreating. But Bundy wanted his herd back and apparently told the mob to, quote, get his cattle. The cattle that was currently being held in a bunch of trailers and impounding facilities, as if they were like cars. Following orders, the army of supporters moved on the impounded site, which was located in a dry wash bed under a bridge. Taking up positions against the officers and federal agents, Bundy demanded the officers leave, and they did, somehow all without a single shot being fired. It is insane, looking back on this, that no one fired a gun. You have people showing up, armed to the teeth, ready for a standoff. And then not only do they successfully get the feds to move backwards, but then they go to the place where the feds are holding the cattle. They set up on roadways with rifles pointed down at them, and at no point did anyone fire a gun. Supporters of Bundy and his cause celebrated what they viewed as a victory. Others were less impressed. Senator Harry Reid, for example, called Bundy a domestic terrorist, which feels at least a little bit extreme. I mean, it was certainly domestic, but I don't know if, fighting the government over cows on their land over a turtle counts as terrorism. The reasons why Harry Reid was so incensed by the Bundy standoff went far beyond a Democrat politician verbally combating a proudly Republican private citizen who defied his government. Reid, a Democratic senator from Nevada and the Senate Majority Leader at the time, seemed especially impassioned about defeating the rancher, and spent years publicly condemning Bundy, his wife, and anyone who supported them. In fact, many believe that Reid was largely the driving force behind the BLM's decision to initiate their standoff when they did. But these weren't just baseless internet theories. For one, the head of the Bureau of Land Management, Neil Corns, had served as Harry Reid's aide for over 35 years. There's plenty of tiffs people get into with the Bureau of Land Management and grazing rights and stuff like that, but there normally isn't the seizing of cattle over it. So it's convenient that the person who is leading the Bureau of Land Management has a very close connection to the politician within Nevada who really does not like Bundy. Well, you may be asking, okay, well then why was Senator Reid so upset with the Bundy family? And that raises us to an even more concerning conflict of interest, which raised a lot of red flags as Reid waged his crusade on the Bundy family. See, for years, the BLM had actively attempted to promote the development of solar energy on its lands. One of these projects was a $5 billion proposal for a solar energy project in Nevada, helmed by a Chinese company called ENN Energy Group, who wanted to build a massive solar farm and panel manufacturing plant in the Nevada desert. This project would require large tracts of public land, and the BLM had been involved in discussions about clearing this federal land for the proposed solar development. Now, you may be putting together some pieces here. The Bureau of Land Management claimed that all of their concerns against Bundy and stuff like that was because they wanted to preserve the natural lands. They wanted to either take care of the turtle, or they wanted the natural prairie grass to grow back in places. But now it turns out that their plan with all of that land was to doze it down and turn it into a Chinese solar power manufacturing facility. This tarnishes the notion that the Bureau of Land Management's primary concern was managing the land. Well, how does all of this relate to Harry Reid? Aside from, of course, Reid being the Nevada senator and supposedly benefiting from all the manufacturing coming to the state. Well, his son, Rory Reid, a former Clark County commissioner, worked as a consultant for ENN Energy Group. So his son is the guy who is trying to get the company from China to put all of the solar energy plants and like solar panels and stuff like that in the middle of Nevada. And that guy's dad is the same senator who was leading the helm for the Bureau of Land Management to kick the guy off of the federal land for the sake of the land that was then going to be turned into a Chinese solar panel manufacturing facility. Every time it's something like this. I bet there wasn't even a turtle there. Obviously, between Reid's connection to his son and Neil Corns at the BLM, it's easy to see why his especially fervent opposition to Cliven Bundy doing whatever he wanted with that land, because that land could have potentially been part of a massive 8-figure project, or at least what was publicly his really overwhelming commitment to federal land rights within the state that he's a senator of. And that's exactly what critics of Reid suggested. Bundy's removal, they said, was at least in part motivated by these political and commercial interests. After all, Harry Reid had been one of the project's most vocal advocates, and even helped recruit ENN during a trip to China in 2011, where he used his political cachet to pressure the Chinese company into entering the deal. And Rory, his son, was a key component in the efforts to help ENN find and acquire the 9,000-acre plot of Nevada land to house the project. By some mysterious, magical, supernatural, whatever, stroke of luck, ENN was somehow able to buy that plot of land at well below the appraised value given by Clark County. Yes, the same Clark County where Rory Reid had previously served as the chair of the county commission. So Reid is a senator and his son works in this county in Nevada in like the commissioner's office, and then both of them go to China, and then suddenly China is able to purchase a bunch of land in the county that Rory worked at, and then there's this guy in the way they don't like, so he suddenly like decides to get his like bestie who works at the Bureau of Land Management to decide that suddenly the grazing rights on that piece of land are a problem because of turtles. These guys suck. Just every time there's some like secret handshake happening that we just see like their virtue signaling effects of to get whatever they want to be done. It's always for a profit every time. I still think that Bundy's strategy was kind of dumb. Like, I understand you don't like the feds owning the land, but yet you're paying them for grazing rights. So just protest that. Don't then argue it's technically a state right or whatever. But I also 100% understand the frustration. Either way, BLM had finally retreated and Bundy and company had secured a victory. For now. On May 8th of 2014, the FBI conducted interviews with officials from the Clark County Sheriff's Office regarding the events of the Bundy standoff. Discussions which revealed a stark contrast in perspective between Bundy supporters and the BLM. One of the key disputes was in regard to who pointed guns at who during the confrontation. Bundy supporters alleged that federal agents had taken up sniper positions and aimed their weapons at civilians, while the BLM maintained that armed protesters had threatened federal officers, justifying the government's aggressive approach. These conflicting narratives would later play a crucial role in the legal battles that would come with both sides trying to frame the events in ways that suited their interests. Now, in the years that followed, the Bundy family definitely didn't help their case. They got into even more public armed conflicts, including the occupation of the Mahler National Wildlife Refuge in Oregon in 2016. This is actually a really common thing I see across a lot of these standoffs. Whenever someone survives a standoff, like Randy Weaver, for example, they tend to show up at a lot of future ones. I guess it's just because, you've done it once, might as well do it again, and there frankly probably is an adrenaline rush to it. Not to say they're the same thing at all, but it's a similar sentiment to people who were in the military and were in combat. They talk about how, sure, it was awful, but the rush of it is something that they miss. To go into detail about that National Wildlife Refuge thing, it was only 2 years after the Nevada standoff. This standoff was led by Ammon Bundy and a group of armed activists who, you guessed it, strongly opposed federal land policies. The occupation occurred as a protest in support of a father and son named Dwight and Stephen Hammond, two ranchers who, in October of 2015, were convicted of arson on BLM-managed land. After the Hammonds and their hunting party had illegally slaughtered several deer on the federally owned property, they allegedly handed out boxes of Strike Anywhere matches and instructed their party to light and drop the matches into the grass to hide the evidence. One witness quoted the Hammonds as saying that they were going to, quote, light up the whole country on fire, while another testified that he barely escaped the flames that had grown to almost 10 feet tall. Witnesses included some of the Hammonds' own relatives. A jury found the Hammonds guilty and also convicted Stephen of arson in a separate fire on BLM land, which had happened a few years prior. So this was who Ammon Bundy had traveled to Oregon to support, which he later said was because, quote, God directed him to go. Okay. In December of 2015, Ammon Bundy and Ryan Payne, who, if you remember, had helped the Bundys organize militia members during the 2014 Nevada standoff, moved to Burns, Oregon together to begin plotting their occupation. They met with Harney County Sheriff David Ward in an attempt to recruit the sheriff to help prevent the Hammonds from being taken to jail. While he explained that he did not have that authority, Ammon Bundy and Ryan Payne allegedly grew angry and threatening. It was around this time that the FBI and local law enforcement became aware that outsiders, primarily militia members, had moved into the Burns area and were prepared for the possibility of criminal activity from the groups. Employees of the Mahler Refuge had also noticed Payne and others casing the refuge over the course of a few weeks. They even had a photo of Payne and Bundy hanging on the wall to help them identify the men, as word had begun to spread that something was potentially brewing. One day, Ryan Payne used a bathroom at the refuge and parked outside, spending what was described as an unusual amount of time over the course of a few days observing who would come and go. As the still undetermined date of occupation drew closer, Ammon would post letters, blogs, and petition decrying the federal ownership of public lands, challenging Sheriff Ward to protect the Hammonds, and serving as a rallying cry for like-minded individuals around the nation. The Hammonds began to distance themselves from Bundy and Payne, and even declined their help. But the mission was already underway, far too late to stop. A powder keg was brewing. It's so funny because, the Hammonds got convicted of arson, right? But because it's a situation involving BLM land, then the whole narrative gets switched into, well, the government's just trying to take, the land that they were rightfully using, even if that wasn't the case. But they get so many people fired up about it. The Bundys get so many people fired up about it. And to go to the small town and, have people show up with, guns, and now they're threatening the sheriff. That the Hammonds, who have been convicted, are like, that's okay. We're all right, really. You're having a protest for someone who doesn't even want to show up to the protest. On December 30th, 2015, federal employees at the Mahler Refuge were told by management that, based on intel provided to them by the FBI, their safety was possibly in jeopardy. They were instructed to go home early and not to come back to work at the refuge until told they could. Meanwhile, with the help of a local man named B.J. Soper, Bundy and Payne organized a group of around 300 protesters and militiamen in support of the Hammonds at the parking lot of a local Safeway. On January 2nd, the rally was held. It was surprisingly peaceful, with protesters marching through town past the sheriff's office and courthouse to the Hammonds' home, and then back to the Safeway and onto the town fairgrounds nearby. But before they could head to their final stop, Ammon Bundy began calling on attendees to follow him to the refuge to take a stand. More than protesting the Hammond sentence, Bundy and Payne wanted to occupy the refuge until the federal government returned the land to local jurisdiction. You can kind of see this escalation in their mind, where they had one standoff go really well a couple years ago, and now they're doing this standoff against a specific case of the Hammonds losing their land to the BLM, or losing their rights to the land to the BLM. And now it's to the point where it's like, you know what? What even is the Bureau of Land Management? Let's get rid of that. Let's turn this back over to the state. As federal authorities attempted to negotiate a peaceful resolution, tensions escalated. On January 26, 2016, FBI agents and Oregon State Police stopped a convoy of occupation leaders on a remote highway. During this confrontation, Robert Lavoy Finicum, a key figure in the standoff, was shot and killed. According to law enforcement, Finicum had reached for a weapon after attempting to evade a police blockade, prompting officers to fire. However, supporters of the Bundys claim Finicum was executed unjustly, pointing to video evidence that, in their view, suggested he posed no imminent threat. Ryan Bundy was also shot during this encounter, sustaining a wound to his shoulder. I've seen some of the footage of this and seen interviews with Finicum before any of this happened. If I recall right, he was a big person at the Bundy standoff as well. And while I can't say for sure the legitimacy of the police shooting in the first place, I will say in a lot of the interviews that Finicum had before, he really had this fighter's mentality to him, that he was ready to die at a moment's notice, that he was going to keep pushing the envelope until something pushed back, and eventually it did. All in all, the event would last 6 weeks, until February 11th of 2016. The day before, on February 10th, Cliven Bundy was arrested at Portland International Airport on federal charges relating to the 2014 standoff. The next morning, the remaining holdouts at Mahler surrendered, ending the standoff on its 41st day. So while they kind of got away with it the first time, doing it a second time and also upping their demand from just give me my cows back to your organization shouldn't exist, everyone was getting shot and arrested one by one. Meanwhile, Cliven Bundy's own trial was still ongoing, and on March of 2016, a federal grand jury indicted 19 individuals involved in the original 2014 standoff in Nevada. The defendants were divided into 3 tiers based on their alleged roles in the confrontation. Cliven, Ammon, and Ryan were in the first tier, labeled as the ringleaders of the movement. The second tier consisted of individuals who played key support roles, organizing logistics and communications for the armed resistance. And then the third tier included rank-and-file supporters who had traveled to the standoff and participated in blocking federal agents. Prosecutors argued that the Bundys had orchestrated a conspiracy to defy federal authority, deceiving people into believing that they were under threat from government snipers. The government sought to focus on the conspiracy and weapons charges, painting Bundy and his allies as agitators who manipulated supporters into taking up arms under false pretense. The defense, however, countered that the Bundys' fears were justified due to the federal surveillance and aggressive tactics used by the BLM. Unfortunately for them, their case was flimsy, as there wasn't evidence, as Ryan Bundy had claimed, snipers aiming their sights and lasers at the ranch, or filming of the Bundys while they were at home. At least there wasn't until the trial began. See, as the trial progressed, cracks began to emerge in the prosecution's case. Prosecution, according to the court, would release information in drips and drabs, and it became apparent the government was withholding key evidence. In August of 2017, the defense requested information regarding the cameras Ryan Bundy had seen placed near their ranch. But the government called this and other requests for information a fantastical fishing expedition. But that November, defense attorneys for the Bundys discovered that the BLM had set up surveillance cameras on a hill northeast of the Bundy home with a live feed to BLM's command center. Ryan Bundy had been right all along. So the prosecution's whole case is that these guys are wrong because they lied to a bunch of supporters to say that the government was spying on them and that the government was coming to get them, which was followed by the government coming to get all of their cows, but whatever. And then during the court case, defense argues time and time again, you had the cameras. Where's the cameras? And the government says, you're making that up. That's a fishing expedition. You're lying. Okay, here's the evidence. We had the cameras. It drives me up a wall that the only reason the government gets away with this kind of thing is because the only people who will challenge them are crazy. Because if I was in this scenario, if I had cattle on government land and they were like, get off, I would get off, because I don't want, not because I'm like, oh, I should, because what about the turtles? Like, I could have my own gripes about the government, but I would be like, it is not worth the headache of dealing with them. Like, my life has more value if I just get land somewhere else to push the cows, right? But every now and then, someone will show up who says that they were told by God directly to go to another standoff 2 years later for guys who set a field on fire, apparently. That guy is going to be the guy to fight back and expose an entire ring of the senator of Nevada getting, stuff from his son in order to sell out land to a Chinese company under the guise of turtle safety. And here they were entirely right about the hidden camera thing, which is something that the media and government vehemently denied. The defense also discovered evidence of several heavily armed patrols near the Bundy property. Between the discovery of the cameras and the armed federal agents, it was suddenly becoming difficult for the government to prove that the Bundys had misled their supporters in order to drum up fear. Presenting this to the court, Bundy's lawyers successfully obtained an order for the U.S. government to hand over any additional evidence related to surveillance and the presence of snipers. What was that evidence? Well, 2 disclosures came in the form of FBI investigative reports known as 302s. The first was a 302 regarding Kevin Egbert, called the Egbert 302. This 302 had, on record, the placement of the camera and attempts to repair it after it had been damaged. The second was a 302 which described the activities of Special Agent Edward Del Molino, known as the Del Molino 302. This 302 described Agent Del Molino as being dressed in BLM tactical gear, stating that he took up an overwatch position near the Bundy Ranch. A thumb drive with a log of activities at the Tactical Observation Center, referred to as the TOC log, was produced on November 11, 2017. This log served as the FBI's record for SWAT operations during the impound operation, and the log referred to the insertion of snipers and recounted descriptions of the live feed from the surveillance camera. The Bundy said as soon as this happened, they set up snipers to watch them and cameras around the property. Government called them crazy for years, took them to court, finally have to admit that they didn't send snipers and cameras to watch their property. Then there were the prosecution's insistence that Cliven Bundy was a violent and dangerous man, which they claimed was why the BLM had failed to enforce the previous infractions and court orders against Bundy. But during a witness testimony for the prosecution, it was revealed that a threat assessment conducted by the BLM concluded Bundy posed no real threat or harm. Upon this discovery, additional threat assessments stating that Bundy only represented a low to moderate risk of violence were turned over. So they did all this sniper and camera observation on him for a time and came to the conclusion that he's probably not going to do anything, which is countered by the sentiment they echo to other government agencies and media that he was definitely going to do something. It is actually insane how many overlaps there are between this and Ruby Ridge, from the cameras and snipers being positioned around the property to agencies lying to other agencies saying that the risk is far greater than it actually was. Maybe on Ruby Ridge there were some turtles. Anyone ever check? At this point, the court wanted answers. Why had government agencies failed to turn in such key evidence as it related to claims made by them and by the defense? They tried to argue that the evidence was essentially irrelevant to the case, and that the officers with sniper rifles weren't technically snipers. They are simply officers who are holding sniper rifles. I'm going to throw something. Explanation which the district court found very troubling. As do I. When the Tier 3 co-defendants were on trial, the court excluded their testimony regarding the presence of snipers based on the government's position that there were none. And now, in the middle of the Bundy family's trial, the government was producing internal documents where they themselves referred to their own agents as snipers. So they say that like the agent holding the sniper rifle isn't a sniper, and then in their own documents talking about it, they call them snipers. Also, what does it matter? Call him a rodeo clown. I don't care. It's a guy paid by the government to hold a rifle on this dude's property. Sniper, whatever. The dude with a gun. After carefully looking over this new evidence, the court concluded that the trial could not proceed and would end in a mistrial. The government had intentionally and willfully withheld prejudicial evidence that was crucial to the trial. And it was also around this time that things got even worse for the BLM. Federal investigator named Larry Wooden issued a furious 18-page memo on November 27, 2017, addressed to Associate Deputy Attorney General Andrew Goldsmith. In the memo, Wooden categorized the BLM's approach to the Bundy standoff as punitive, ego-driven, and likened the agent's behavior to those of middle schoolers. That's pretty cool of him to say that. I like that. Wooten had been brought in to assess the BLM's handling of the 2014 standoff and found serious misconduct and various violations of policy, ethics, and the law. Investigators had openly referred to the Bundys and their supporters with numerous vulgar and profane terms, as well as terms he deemed sexually inappropriate. He said agents at the BLM had intentionally found and used degrading photos of the Bundys in presentation within their offices, including some that had been manipulated on purpose. And if you remember the arrest of Dave Bundy and his subsequent claims of unnecessary force, well, Wooten's memo stated he had heard the agents involved bragging about roughing up the younger Bundy, including grinding his face into the ground so hard that he, quote, had little bits of gravel stuck in his face. Oh, would you look at that? Another example of the government saying they didn't do something, investigating themselves to find that they didn't do it, only for years later to turn out that they did it. When Larry Wooten tried raising these concerns, they were ignored, and he was eventually removed from the investigation by the U.S. Attorney's Office. When this happened, a supervisor of Wooten's ransacked his office and seized notes, personal documents, including medical records, and files relevant to the case. In a quote, Wooten said, "I am convinced that I was removed to prevent the ethical and proper further disclosure of the severe misconduct, failure to correct and report, and cover-ups by BLM supervisors." Wooten would go on to describe a widespread culture of bias and misconduct within the BLM, especially against the Bundys. He accused the agency of inflating the threat level and using excessive force, and further detailed instances of evidence suppression, where key information favorable to the Bundys had been deliberately buried by federal prosecutors. As you guys probably remember, in the 1992 Ruby Ridge standoff, the FBI altered rules of engagement, leading to the controversial shooting of Randy Weaver's wife and son. Similarly, during the Waco siege in 1993, federal agencies were accused of suppressing information about the use of incendiary devices that contributed to the deadly fire at the Branch Davidian compound. Through both of these instances, they continued to lie and lie and lie until the evidence was uncovered, but the people were already exonerated. This is one of those stories in which nobody really comes out a winner. Cliven Bundy, while motivated by beliefs that are perhaps at their very core understandable or even noble to some, seems to have lost the plot. While his grievances in the beginning, in my opinion, were completely justified, it seems his story became one of war against the government for the sake of it. However, like many things within the federal government, the BLM seems to have become too big to fail, corrupted by politics and money, and as a result has seemed to remain focused on achieving what it was initially created to do. The U.S. Attorney's Office and prosecution prove that, once again, they want to win at all cost, and are not afraid to skirt or even outright break the law in order to prevail in court. And the rest of the Bundy family's desire to cede all or most federal control to individual states seemed to play out in really confusing ways that didn't really accomplish what they maybe wanted to do. And on top of that, Cliven Bundy seems to be not the best individual outside of some appropriate problems he probably had with the state. But as mentioned, it normally takes some weird people to highlight the weirder issues with the government. All in all, this is a weird case that seems to be forgotten by most. I think the reason it doesn't have the same infamy as things like Waco or Ruby Ridge is frankly because it didn't have a kill count, at least the initial instance didn't. But regardless, I think it's interesting and worth talking about, and hopefully you did as well, and we just want to say thank you for watching. This has always been an interesting story to me. I've thought about covering it on the main channel for a while, but to be honest, Oki's Weird Stories did such a great job. Like, he went to Nevada and interviewed like the Bundys and a bunch of people involved and did like a comprehensive background into like their lives before and after the standoff. The video is far better than mine, but I wanted to talk about it somewhere, and this seemed like a good place. So if this interested you at all, I cannot recommend Oki's video enough. I'll have it linked in the description. That guy's one of the best YouTubers on the platform. But hopefully you enjoyed. New content coming every week, and everyone who worked on this video, as always, will be mentioned in the description below. Be sure to show them some love. That should do it for now, but we just want to say thank you for watching. We hope that you enjoyed, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye!